Good morning, TikTok. I'm hoping that you guys can help me get this story to the Sean Ryan Show. This is the unknown background story of how the Vietnam Tomb of the Unknown Soldier was set into place. It all starts with this guy right here. This handsome dude called Mike Wherley. Sergeant Wherley served in Army Special Forces from 1970 to 1974. This picture was taken in 1972. This story shows you how God moves and God takes time to make things happen. And it starts in Vietnam. And it starts during the war when Mike was traveling from one point to another and his group was ambushed. At some point during the ambush, it appeared to Mike and everyone around him that this could be it, that they may not make it out of this one. However, in the moment of that realization and the fear, a calm came over Sergeant Wherley. In that calm, he described a voice, an inner voice, something that told him, "I'm going to get you out of this, but you owe me one." Which is kind of funny because it's a very human thing to say. All of a sudden, one of his buddies comes out of nowhere with something and takes care of the entire ambush. Him and his buddies get up, they're saved, they're alive, they, cheer, and on to their next mission. Sergeant Wherley continues on, glad to be alive, what an experience, on to the next. He doesn't really think much of this until 1980. In 1980, Mike went to visit the Arlington Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And what he realized is that there was no official tomb for the veteran of the Vietnam War. In that moment of realization, believe it or not, Mike heard that voice again. That voice said, "Remember, you owe me one." When Mike tells this story, there is no doubt that it is true. You can feel it. It is known. But unfortunately, the story behind it is unknown. The spiritual movement that pushed Mike to go further. On October 7th, 1980, Mike wrote an article for the York Dispatch. In this article, he states, "I noticed that there was no tomb for the Vietnam War veterans. It is a true symbol of the way Vietnam vets are treated and looked upon by this country. Weren't those men honorable enough? Isn't there room for them here in front? Give our honorable Vietnam unknown soldiers the place of honor they deserve. They were as brave, as honorable, and devoted to their country as any of the soldiers of the previous wars." Mike Wherley. On Friday, November 6, 1981, Congressman Bill Goodling, who I got to know personally as a kid, addressed the House of Representatives. He said, "Mr. Speaker, now that Veterans Day is approaching, I would like to draw my fellow members' attention to the situation of the utmost gravity. As you know, in 1973, Congress gave authorization for a Vietnam unknown to rest alongside the American unknowns of previous foreign wars. The designate resting place for the Vietnam unknown, although empty, was marked with a white marble cover from October 1974 to March 1975. When after the fall of Saigon it was removed and the crypt was covered over with red granite with nothing left to mark it. This shameful state of affairs was brought to my attention by my constituents. Mike Wherley himself, a veteran of the Vietnam War, Mr. Wherley formed the Committee for the Vietnam Unknown and together with other Vietnam veterans was agitated for the internment of a Vietnam unknown at Arlington Cemetery. However, the crypt for a Vietnam unknown remains empty and unmarked with no indication at the memorial to give a reason why. Now, many veterans feel that they have been dealt a raw deal. Having fought in a faraway land and having seen many of their friends killed and mutilated in an unofficial war, they returned home only to be ostracized for their part in Vietnam by an uncaring country which feels that its involvement in Vietnam was a shameful one, best forgotten. In fact, it is that attitude which is shameful by internment of a Vietnam unknown with all due honor at Arlington Cemetery. We would help to right the wrong felt by our unsung heroes of Vietnam. We would then be able to unite as a nation and focus our attention on the accounting for and recovery of those Americans still missing in Southeast Asia. In 1984, May 31st, 1984, 3 years later, Congressman Bill Goodling is still at it trying to help out these veterans. He says, Mr. Speaker, my involvement in the Vietnam unknown soldier issue began with a letter from my constituent, Mike Wherley, in October 1980. In his letter, Mike noticed the absence of the Vietnam unknown at the tomb of the unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery, and the fact that there was not even a marker to indicate why. His letter was duly bucked or referred to the Department of Army Legislative Liaison for a response. From the initial response from the Army, he learned that the same strict criteria, standards, and selection of an unknown from World War I, World War II, and the Korean conflict were being used for Vietnam, and that at the time there were only 3 partial remains at the Army Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii. None of those partial remains met with the standards of the selection of the unknown. There was an 80% remains criteria which they did not meet. All other remains that had been returned from Vietnam had been identified. Following the response, an exchange of letters between Mr. Goodling and the Veteran Affairs Committee Chairman Sonny Montgomery and Secretary of the Army John Marsh ensued, but no resolution of the issue. This led to the meeting on July 7, 1981 of Mike Wherley, Harold Redding, a Vietnam veteran, and my staffer Kimberly Burns, with Lieutenant Colonel James P. King and the Army's Civil Works Office in the Pentagon. Mike and Harold understood 3 promises have been made at that meeting. First, that the guards at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier be informed of the situation of an unknown for Vietnam and be instructed to inform visitors who might ask about in public Law 93-43, which authorizes the internment of an unknown from Vietnam, and that an investigation was being pursued for the selection of such an unknown. Second, that the temporary plaque citing Public Law 93-43 be placed next to the permanent bronze plaque explaining the selection process. And third, that the 80% remains criteria be waived and only the requirement for the aforementioned public law be used in the selection of the unknown from Vietnam, namely, that an unidentified U.S. serviceman who died in Southeast Asia during the years of our involvement in the Vietnam conflict be interred at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at Arlington Cemetery. A second meeting at the Pentagon with Lieutenant Colonel King's replacement, Major, now Lieutenant Colonel Dave Pixado, took place on October 6. Major Pixado was unaware of the promises that Mike and Harold understood to have been made, which had not been carried out. Again, the waiving of the 80% criteria was urged with the plea that the temporary plaque be installed until an unknown could be interred. Another letter exchange between myself, who would be Congressman Bill Goodling, and Secretary Marsh ensued. Marsh apologized for the misunderstanding about the plaque and stated that he would speak with Secretary of Defense Weinberger about waiving the 80% criteria. In November 1981, 2 sets of letters to Secretary Marsh and Weinberger with a total of 71 signatures of members of Congress were sent urging that the 80% criteria be waived. Also, at the end of the month, Mike Wherley and I met with Mrs. Ann Mills Griffiths of the National League of Families and Missing in Southeast Asia to discuss and try to resolve the League's opposition to the internment of an unknown soldier for Vietnam. Fearing that such an action would close the book on the Vietnam era and that all serious attempts to gain an accounting for our missing in Vietnam would then halt, the League opposed the continued and opposed internment. Throughout the first half of 1982, the letter exchange between Secretary of Defense and the Army and myself continued with no resolution. That spring, Mike was able to speak to Secretary Weinberger when he came to the York, PA, to give a commencement speech at York College. In July, there were indications that the Secretary March was about to make a decision on the internment, but no definite action was taken. On September 8, 1982, Congressman introduced House Concurrent Resolution 413 urging the President to provide as expeditiously as possible for the internment of the unknown for Vietnam at Arlington. There were 70 co-sponsors within 2 months, but no action was taken on the resolution. In December 1982, Jack Anderson wrote a column in which he claims that I introduced this resolution at the urging of the Secretary Marsh and that the stalling over internment was because of the infighting at the Department of Defense. Mike Wherley refuted this charge in the York Sunday News, explaining that he was responsible for having aroused my interest and concern on this issue. On February 3rd, 1983, Mike Wherley and I met with Commander Stuart Ring, Al Berry, and Dick Childress from the administration in my Washington office. The next day, in a letter to Secretary Weinberger, I reiterated my desire to see a temporary plaque installed at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and that the Department of Defense present a folder on the partial remains that they had to the Vietnamese at their next meeting to discuss an accounting of American missing to make a final good faith effort to identify those remains, and if they prove to be unidentified at the point to interment at the tomb. Secretary Weinberger approved of the idea of a temporary plaque, and after yet another meeting with his representatives in my office, plans were made for the installation of 2 plaques at the tomb, one next to the permanent bronze plaque and movable, one actually where the Vietnam unknown would be interred. The plaques were installed on May 30th, 1983. Previously, in April, I reintroduced the resolution urging the President to allow for the internment of the Vietnam unknown. When no further progress to such an end was made by Veterans Day 1983, I met with Assistant Secretary of Army William Ganelli and Lieutenant Colonel Dave Piexato at my Washington office on December 15th. While Mr. Ganelli assured me that the 80% criteria was no longer a stumbling block, he continued to cite the paucity, I don't know what that word is, of the remains at hand as the reason for holding off on interment. This meeting was followed by yet another letter to Secretary Weinberger urging the Public Law 93-43 be used as the only criteria for internment. On April 12th, almost a year after the introduction of my second resolution, I called Secretary Ganelli's office for a definite response and was informed that his decision had indeed been made to inter partial remains. An official announcement was made on April 13th. It is important to note that from 1980 to 1990 to 1985, Mike was being held off on this whole situation because he was being told that DNA would be an identifier soon and it wouldn't be necessary. If you look here, it took till 1998 for them to identify a Lieutenant Michael J. Blassie. They kept telling Mike that they were close, but it took them another 14 years to identify. So that's the story of how the Vietnam Tomb of the Unknown Soldier was put into place. And it was done. And it was moved by Spirit, God, whatever you want to call it. So Sean Ryan, if you're listening, Everybody should know all the loopholes and all the things that they had to jump through, all the hoops, all the stuff that they had to do, all the push off just to get this in place. What a story. It's high frequency. Light up the dark.